Hi, everyone, and welcome to Astro at Home, presented by Discover the Universe, which is where I work. My name is Lindsay Mann, and we're very excited to bring you these astronomy teaching lessons into your home during at this time where we're all working from home and learning from home. Today, before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to remind you guys of some of our rules about the chat. So we love to get questions from you guys. Please send them at any time throughout the presentation. But we want you to stay respectful and refrain from spamming, which means sending several messages at a time. If anyone breaks those rules, we'll delete your message or put you in a timeout. And we'd prefer not to do that because we want to get your questions. So please respect those rules. Today, I'm very excited to reintroduce you guys to Nathalie Ouellette, who is an astronomer working with the the Institute for Research on Exoplanets, which is also known as IREX. And she's going to talk to you guys today about all the different colors of the universe. Welcome, Nathalie.
Hi, thanks for having me again.
My pleasure.
So today we'll be talking about the kaleidoscopic universe, and a kaleidoscope is a toy that I had when I was a kid. I don't know if they are very common anymore, but essentially it's like this little looking glass that you would put to your eye, and you would see all of the room around you, but like in all kinds of funky shapes, and it would like be mirroring everything, and it really gives you a different perspective of the universe. So we're going to be looking at the kaleidoscopic universe, which means all of the different colors that you have in the universe. So in order to understand color, the first thing you need to understand is light. So light around us is something that we depend on. It's something we're familiar with. And one of the biggest sources of light for us is the sun. Sunlight appears relatively white to us. It's a part of light that we call the visible light. And the reason why humans can see really well this kind of light is because our star, the sun, peaks in that kind of light. So that means there are actually different kinds of light. We just happen to be really good at looking at visible light, and we call it visible because it's visible to humans, because the sun is really bright in this visible light. But you might have seen either for yourself, if you were lucky enough to do this experiment at home or at school or in a museum, or you might have seen just a diagram or a video of this, but we're actually able to take the white light from the sun that's all around us and diffract it or break it up into its different components. So to do this, we use a glass prism. It's like this little pyramid, essentially, that's made of glass. And when you shine white light, like the light that comes from the sun, through this prism, you break up all the different lights that are the colors that are mixed up together to make this white light. And those are all the different colors of the rainbow, actually. And you don't actually need to do this experiment yourself because nature does this for you when you see a rainbow in the sky. So in this instant, usually you see a rainbow after a rain shower, but when there's sunlight there. So all the little rain droplets that are still suspended up in the air, they're the ones who act like a prism. And when the sunlight shines through these little rain droplets, they break up all the different colors in the white light of the sun, and they make a rainbow. So this is what you can see when you see a rainbow outside. And this is proof that there's more to light than what you may initially see. So there's all these different colors. Nature does it. You can do it yourself with a prism as well. But there's not only this visible kind of light. Scientists many hundreds of years ago actually started thinking, well, maybe there's part of the light that is invisible to us, but is visible in different ways, either with instruments or even other animals. They can see this different kind of light. So a scientist many hundreds of years ago named Herschel, he did the experiment using a prism. He broke up the sunlight, made all the different colors of the rainbow, and he put a thermometer across these different colors that he spotted. But what he actually saw is that the thermometer showed a higher temperature right next to the last visible color that he could see, red. So he couldn't see any color there, but he saw that there was some kind of radiation that was still being broken up from the sunlight, and that was making the thermometer increase, and it was proving that there was like a temperature spike there. So there was an invisible form of light that wasn't visible to him, but it was visible to the thermometer. So he could see the effect of that specific kind of light. So one of the questions that I have here is, can water do this? And indeed, a water droplet in the sky from rain will be able to do that. You can do this with just a glass of water as well, but you have to sort of really angle the light that's shining through the water at like the right angle. You have to sort of play around with it a little bit. So I mentioned this invisible kind of light that William Herschel discovered for the first time using his prism and his thermometer, but that's only scratching the very surface of all the invisible light that is around us. And all the different kinds of light that we have, we put them all together in what we call the electromagnetic spectrum. So spectrum means that there's all different kinds of lights. They're all different kinds, not only the visible type that we know of. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the different kinds of light that the universe shines in and the different objects in space that shine in these different kinds of light. So here you have the electromagnetic spectrum, and there are different ways you can describe this electromagnetic spectrum. You can describe it using what we call wavelength. So light is actually a wave, and a wave will have peaks and troughs, or bottom parts and up parts. And you can actually measure the distance between two peaks, and that gives you a length. That's the wavelength. Types of lights that are very, very energetic will have short wavelengths. That means that there's a very small distance between two peaks. And those are the types of light that have very, very, very energetic. They're very, very energetic. And so they can actually be a little bit damaging to us. But you also have very, very long wavelength lights. And that's something like radio or even microwave. And those are not quite so dangerous for us. Visible light is sort of like right in the middle. So you can talk about light in terms of wavelength. We have different names for these different types of light, and I will mention those as well. And so the very, very energetic types of lights, they are usually produced by something that's very, very hot. So a really, really, really hot star will be very, very bright in energetic light with very, very short wavelengths. And that's typically something in the gamma ray or the X-ray. So you might know a little bit about X-rays. Something that's colder, like if you have dust or gas in space that's very, very cold, it'll shine more brightly in long wavelengths, less energy. And that's something like radio. So we'll sort of go through all these different kinds of lights together. So I got the question, who did the thermometer experiment? His name was William Herschel. And what he discovered at that point was infrared light. And in his honor, because he was a great pioneer in infrared astronomy and infrared science, we named an infrared telescope after William Herschel. It was launched about a decade ago, and it saw the universe in infrared light, not visible light. I have another question here. Is that why we have cool and warm colors? So cool and warm colors is actually more about a perception. It's not really the temperature of the object that's shining. So a cool color, you might think, is sort of like a purple, a green, a blue. And actually, ironically, an object that is warmer is going to shine at those lights, and an object that's cooler that's going to shine in the reds and oranges and yellow. So it's sort of the opposite of what we mean when we talk about cool and warm colors. Cool and warm colors is more of a perception. It's more of a psychological effect. Whereas what I'm talking about here is what happens physically with these different objects. Do we have any machines that can see ultraviolet or infrared? And I'm actually going to talk about that in just a minute, so I'll be able to answer that question. So I talked about looking at all the different lights around us, but we are looking at all this light from the universe in our little cocoon, in our protective cocoon, where we have the atmosphere around the Earth that protects us. And it's a really, really good thing that it's protecting us, because a lot of the energetic rays that are going around through space, they really, they could harm us a lot. So we have been very fortunate to evolve and develop on this Earth where we're protected. So here up top and below also, you have in the horizontal direction, all the different kinds of lights going from really, really energetic towards the left to a lot less energetic towards the right. And it shows you how much of that kind of light the atmosphere blocks up, from 0 to 100%. So you can see that luckily, the really, really energetic types of lights, like gamma rays and X-rays that are on the left side of the graph, they're blocked 100% by our atmosphere. So that's lucky for us, because they would be very dangerous for us otherwise. You see, afterwards, we have a big dip where we go almost to 0% blocking power by the atmosphere. That's where we have visible light. Then it starts going up again. That's where we have infrared light, and the atmosphere blocks a good proportion of that infrared light. And then it goes back down again, dips down to 0, where we have our radio light. So radio waves is what we use for telecommunication. And one of the reasons why we developed our telecommunication based on radio is because our atmosphere is not blocking those kinds of light. It's very transparent to it, so we can send them very far away to other places on Earth. So I had the question, if we have machines that can see ultraviolet and infrared, and we totally do, we have to use all kinds of different eyes and different instruments to look at the universe in these different kinds of light. So the ones that you might know more about, telescopes that are similar to the ones that you might have at home, they see very, very well invisible light. But there are certain types of telescopes who don't see visible light at all. They can only look at infrared light or only ultraviolet light. But because I mentioned that the atmosphere blocks certain kinds of light, we have to decide where to build these telescopes based on the kind of light that they are studying. So if we are interested in visible light, we can build our telescopes here on Earth because the atmosphere lets all the visible light from the universe through, so we can study it. Same thing with radio waves. But for infrared and X-ray and gamma ray and ultraviolet light, the atmosphere blocks it. That's why we have to send some telescopes out into space above the atmosphere so that it can actually see all that kind of light from the universe without it getting blocked by the atmosphere on the Earth. So we're going to start with a very, very most energetic type of light. It's gamma rays. And gamma rays are emitted by things that are super, super energetic, super, super hot. So sometimes millions of degrees Celsius. So a lot hotter than most of the things that we have here on Earth. And a type of phenomenon that we can have here on Earth that also emits gamma rays is nuclear reactions. So if you see maybe a story about a nuclear reactor or something related to nuclear materials like plutonium or uranium, they will have nuclear reactions within them, and they will emit gamma rays that are very, very dangerous for humans. That's why we have to protect ourselves, and we can't sort of just walk around a nuclear reactor and be exposed to all these gamma rays, because they can affect our cells very negatively. So two types of objects in the universe that are very, very bright in gamma rays are gamma ray bursts and solar flares. So I'll start with solar flares because it's something that's more familiar to us. The sun is our star, and it's not just static. There's a lot of action that happens on it. It has sunspots, but it also has solar flares, which are these like big explosions on the surface of the sun. And when you have a big explosion that happens as a solar flare on the sun, you can have lots of energy that is released suddenly, and some of it is emitted in gamma rays. But as I mentioned, luckily, the Earth has an atmosphere that protects us from these gamma rays. So you don't have to worry. Just because there's a solar flare doesn't mean that you're going to get hit with gamma rays, because we're well protected. Gamma ray bursts is another kind of a phenomenon, very mysterious, that is very, very bright in gamma rays. And it's actually the brightest kind of explosion that we have anywhere in the universe, even brighter than a supernova, which you might have heard of, which happens at the end of the life of a star. So we're not actually sure what gamma ray bursts are from, but we think maybe it has something to do with the collision of two super, super massive stars. And when they collide together, they explode essentially and make a gamma ray burst. But it's still a very, very mysterious phenomenon, but it's very bright in gamma rays. I have a few more questions here that I'll go through. Is color really endless? So the electromagnetic spectrum is technically endless. You could have something, a type of light that is infinitely energetic with an infinitely short wavelength, but essentially at some point, something can't produce enough energy to, go infinitely small. So in the real world, we see a sort of limit to how small of a wavelength we can get. The same thing sort of happens in the radio waves. You could have a radio wave that's infinitely long, but that doesn't really happen in nature. So there's a sort of limit to how long a radio wave tends to be. Do you use radio waves to receive information from probes that are sent to the farthest parts of our solar system? We do. So we've sent probes for decades now in all directions in the solar system. And the two that have traveled the farthest from Earth are Voyager 1 and 2, and they send the information that they collect back to Earth using radio waves. So they have these old antennae that are on the probes, and they send all the information. And because they can pass through the atmosphere, we have these big radio telescopes that listen in on what the probes are saying. So another question I have here is, so red is hotter than green? Technically, it's the opposite. It's very, very counterintuitive, but red is emitted by objects that are cooler than a green light would be emitted. So you have to go in the opposite order of the rainbow. The coolest objects will emit more in red, and then you go through orange, yellow, green, blue, and then the hottest objects will emit more in violet or purple. So it's sort of the opposite of what we tend to think. Is it possible that a star can be more than 1,000,000 degrees? So it can, but not on its surface. 1,000,000 degrees is too hot for a star to be on its surface, but the center of a star can be really, really hot, like 1,000,000 degrees. We think the center of our sun is in the millions of degrees, so super, super hot. Do neutron stars emit gamma rays? So indeed, some neutron stars and some types of stars that you might have heard about, also pulsars, can emit a little bit in gamma rays. They tend to emit more in the next kind of light, which is X-rays, which is an excellent segue here. So the next most energetic kind of light is X-rays. And they are something that we use in our daily lives in medicine a lot. X-rays can go through our bodies, but they sort of bounce back when they meet metal or our bones. So we can actually see through human muscles and tissues like that. But there are things in the universe that also emit very strongly in X-rays. And a lot of X-ray phenomenon are related to stars. So neutron stars is something that can happen at the end of the lifetime of a star. If a star is bigger, relatively big, a lot bigger than our sun, at the end of its life, there's a supernova, and then you end up with a little leftover at the center. The leftover can sometimes be a neutron star. It's sometimes a black hole instead. And those can emit very brightly in the X-ray because they're very, very hot. Also, you are left over at the end of the explosion with a nebula, or what we call stellar leftovers, and that can also shine brightly in the X-ray. So it's actually really important to study X-rays if you want to try to understand black holes, because if you saw my previous presentation on black holes, you can't actually see a black hole itself because it absorbs all the light. It doesn't let any light escape. So if you want to study a black hole, you can't observe it directly, unfortunately. You have to sort of see things that are going on around it. And because there's X-ray emission around a black hole, it can give you some information on the black hole itself. So X-rays are very, very important to study the lifetime and especially the death of stars, especially for objects that we can't observe directly. So, and a few different questions now. What causes a solar flare? So that's still a little bit of a mystery, actually. Solar flares, they happen on the surface of the sun, and on the surface of the sun, you have what are called little convection cells. So you have energy that's sort of being circled around, it's cycled up and down on the surface of the sun, and it's being churned up and down, and sometimes you will just have an excess of energy, and that is sort of pushed out into the sun. There's a lot that we still don't know about the sun, and it's important that we find out more because the sun can have a big effect on our daily lives and also on all the satellites that we put up into orbit. They can be damaged by solar flares. So it's still a little bit of a mystery what causes solar flares. All right, moving on to the next most energetic light, ultraviolet and visible light. So this is the light that you might be the most familiar with because it's the one that you use to see all around you. So visible light is what you use. Ultraviolet, you don't use, but there are actually lots of animals that can see ultraviolet light. Different kinds of birds, different kinds of reptiles, and different kinds of insects. And a lot of them use ultraviolet light because plants actually emit some amount of ultraviolet light, and they often feed off of plants and flowers especially, or the nectar and pollen found inside those flowers. So they have evolved over time to spot those kinds of flowers. So sunlight is visible light, ultraviolet light as well, which is why we have to protect ourselves using sunscreen. So the atmosphere I mentioned blocks out lots of different kinds of light. It blocks out most of the ultraviolet light, but it lets a little bit of ultraviolet light pass through, which is why we need to use sunscreen to protect ourselves. So the things that are most commonly studied in ultraviolet light and visible light in the universe are stars and galaxies, which are basically just made up of stars. But there's still a big difference in what you can see depending on if you're looking at visible or ultraviolet light. So here we have exactly the same object, the same galaxy. On the left, you're looking at ultraviolet light, and on the right, you're looking at visible light. So on top of there being stars in a galaxy, there's also lots of dust, and dust can block out part of the starlight in a galaxy. But it doesn't block out all kinds of light. It blocks out visible light, but it actually lets ultraviolet light pass through pretty well. Also, different kinds of stars will shine at different kinds of light. So here you have a little color chart, and it tells you that different colored stars will have different temperatures. So remember when I mentioned that really, really hot objects will shine more blue, and then really, really cold objects will shine more red? Well, here, if you have a colder star, it's still 3,000 degrees, but it's relatively cold. You'll have a star that looks very red. If you have a very, very hot star that is 40,000, 50,000 degrees, even sometimes 100,000 degrees, it'll shine more blue or bluish white. If you have something that's more like the sun, about 6,000 degrees, it's right in the middle and it shines more at yellow. So when you're looking here at the galaxy, if you're looking at ultraviolet light, you're looking at the most massive stars, the hottest stars in that galaxy. But if you're looking instead in visible light, well, number one, part of that light is being blocked by dust that is in the galaxy. And number two, you're looking at a different population of stars there. So I have a question here about the James Webb Space Telescope. And it's sort of related to what I'm going to talk about here, but it was also related to radio waves. So will it emit information by radio waves? So the James Webb Space Telescope is an infrared telescope that's going to be launched next year. And it's actually going to be looking at infrared light. So infrared light was the invisible light that William Herschel, the scientist that I mentioned at the start, discovered first using a thermometer. And so it's a little bit cooler than red light, but it actually is something that you might have seen in like a science fiction movie. If you ever saw at some point they're looking through night vision goggles and they're trying to spot animals or other humans in the dark. And that's because humans and animals, with our temperatures of about 37 degrees Celsius, we shine very brightly in the infrared light. But there's lots of different things in the universe that shine brightly in the infrared light as well. And the James Webb Space Telescope will be studying those things. However, that's what it's going to be studying. It's still going to be communicating with scientists on Earth using radio waves, just like the Voyager probes that I mentioned. So it will be looking at infrared light, but it will be sending back the information to us using radio waves. So I mentioned lots of different things that you can look at using infrared light. The dust that I mentioned that blocks out part of starlight, especially visible light, it itself will reabsorb the starlight that it blocks and re-emit it as infrared light. So if you want to understand the dust that is in galaxies, and it might not sound like the most thrilling thing to study, but because it does block out so much starlight, it's super important for us to understand how it works because it's just everywhere in galaxies. Well, you have to use infrared light for that. And we are not the only objects that, have the right kind of temperature to shine in infrared lights. Where we live also has that temperature. So planets tend to shine very brightly in infrared light too. So here on the right, you have a picture of the planet Jupiter. And it's not sort of the typical side of Jupiter that we get to see. We tend to see it sort of face on with its red, big swirling storm. This is the top of Jupiter where you still see swirling storms, but it's right at the pole of it. And it was taken by a probe named Juno a few years ago, taken in the infrared light. So planets like Earth and Jupiter, they shine very brightly in infrared light. I mentioned dust and how it blocks out visible light. So here you have the Pillars of Creation, a very beautiful picture taken by the Hubble Space Telescope, and it shows a bunch of dust that is blocking out lots and lots of information here. So I think that it's a really fascinating thing to compare different objects seen in different kinds of light. And so here you have the pillars of creation taken in visible light, but if you look at exactly the same image, but now in infrared light, you'll be able to see lots of information that was blocked out by the dust here. So you get to punch through the dust essentially to try to figure out all the things that the dust is hiding. So using infrared light allows you to do that. So it's super important to do that. So let me just give a little bit of an explanation on the kaleidoscopic universe. So kaleidoscopic, when I say that, all I mean is multicolored. So because when I used to look through a kaleidoscope when I was young, it sort of gives you a different point of view of the room around you, and it looks really colorful and trippy and very, very sort of magical. So the kaleidoscopic universe is the universe that's all around you. It's just all the different colors that the universe can take. It's just that because we have human eyes that can only see a part of those colors, we are sometimes blind to all the different colors of the universe. So the kaleidoscopic universe isn't a different universe. It's the universe around us that's mostly invisible until we can start using different instruments or different telescopes to try and see the different colors of our universe. So it's just the different colors of our universe, essentially. The last kind of light that I want to mention here are radio waves, and these are the longest wavelengths and the least energetic, and they're emitted by the coldest objects. So I mentioned that they are something that we use in our everyday lives. We use them for telecommunication all around us, but we actually also use them to make our meals. So we can incorporate microwaves inside of radio waves. Microwaves are on the more energetic spectrum of radio waves, but essentially when you pop something into your microwave and you want to warm it up, your food is being bombarded by microwaves that then make the molecules in your food vibrate and start heating up, essentially. So you use radio waves and microwaves maybe more than you realize. But there are other things in the universe that also shine very brightly in the radio waves. And one thing that is all around us is the Big Bang. So the Big Bang is something that happened at the very, very start of the universe, 13.7 billion years ago. But when it happened, it sort of left like an echo, like a background noise that is all around us, no matter in which direction you look at in the sky. It's all over the place. But because it's had so much time to cool off, essentially the whole history of the universe, it is now very, very cold, which is why it shines brightly in the radio wave spectrum, because it's very, very cold. So if you have ever seen an old television that can have some sort of snowy, staticky channels, part of what you're seeing in those snowy channels is the leftover of the Big Bang. So it's really all around us, and astronomers can see it no matter where they're looking at in the sky. We also have galaxies that have supermassive black holes at the center, and we even have one that's at the center of our galaxy. So it's like a black hole, but even bigger. The one in our galaxy is named Sagittarius A star. And sometimes when a supermassive black hole is very actively eating something, it'll emit these big jets that are propulsed from it. And that's because it's eating, but it's eating very messily. So it's almost like you're trying to like drink a lot of water all at once. Some of the water will start spilling out from the sides of your mouth because your mouth is too small to drink all the water. Essentially, that's what's happening with a supermassive black hole. You'll have some of the stuff that it's trying to eat, gas and dust, being blown out into jets. And because those are blown out into very, very long distances, they have a long distance to cool. So they're also very bright in the radio waves. There's a question here about dust. Is the dust that I'm talking about here the same that we can find sort of around your home on an old toy, maybe under your bed? And it's not quite that. So the consistency of the dust you find in the universe is a little bit more akin to if you have a fireplace, all the sort of soot, the very, very fine dust that you find maybe in your barbecue. That's sort of what the consistency is like. So it's very, very, very fine, and it's dispersed all over the universe. Another question here, can you look at a brown dwarf star in infrared light? And indeed you can. So infrared light is not only important to look at planets, but it's also really important to look at brown dwarfs. So brown dwarfs are a pretty mysterious type of object. They're in between a really, really big, massive planet and a small star. So the smallest, coldest stars are also pretty bright in the infrared. And so everything between cold stars and planets are very bright in the infrared. So brown dwarfs, they're sort of in between. They're like, some people call them really, really big planets. Some people call them failed stars. They're like in between, and the infrared light is the best way to study these kinds of objects. So now I want to encourage you to explore some of these interesting phenomena that are bright in different kinds of light at home. So I'll give you just a minute here to, if you're interested, you can go to open up a browser, go to this website. It's called Cosmic Colors. It's by NASA. And together we can look at a few different objects that are shining in different lights. So I'm going to share my browser with you instead of my PowerPoint presentation. So let me do that right here. Right here. All right. So this is something called Cosmic Colors. You can do it with your parent. You can do it with friends online, and you can sort of share your experience together. You just have to make sure that you have a kind of application that's called Flash on your computer to be able to do it. So here you have different kinds of objects. So you can click on them. So you can take, for example, the Crab Nebula. The Crab Nebula is something that happens. It's the leftover of a supernova explosion that happened about 1,000 years ago. And it left this really, really pretty sort of shape of gas and dust called a nebula. And at the center, you have something called a neutron star that I mentioned is very bright in the X-rays and a little bit of the gamma rays. So the Crab Nebula, this is what it looks like in visible light, but you can also go to look at it through X-rays. So here you can see that you lose all of the structure of the sort of the filaments that are around it. And what you're seeing mostly is emission coming from the neutron star that is found at the center of the nebula. So the leftover or the corpse of the star that was there before. If you're looking instead in ultraviolet light, here, you're again missing all the filament information around it. You're seeing more of the really superheated gas that's close to the neutron star at the center. So you can do this exercise with lots of different objects. You have the moon here. This is what it looks like in the visible light. But if you're looking instead in radio, you'll see that you lose all of the information on the craters and everything there. So you can do this as much as you want. There's like a surprisingly large amount of different objects you can look at. One thing that I'll go through a few more of your questions, but one thing I wanted to mention before I do that is today is the 30th anniversary of the Hubble Space Telescope. The Hubble Space Telescope sees invisible light. So it's something that it's very close to what your eyes would see if they had really, really good resolution, but it's up into space, so it doesn't have to deal with light pollution or clouds or anything like that. So I mentioned it's the 30th anniversary today. So it's probably older than lots of you. It's just a little bit younger than me. And if you're interested, you can go on hubblesite.org and you can look at some of the most amazing things that the Hubble Space Telescope has discovered over the last 30 years. So lots of different things. There's a really pretty video here, and there's lots of images that you can look at. You can also look at this special image that was released just today, that was released for the 30th anniversary, and it's called the Cosmic Reef, and it's two nebulae. So a nebula is usually related to either the birth of a star or the death of a star. And here you have two stellar nurseries where a bunch of massive stars are being born. So you have the blue one a little bit smaller in the corner. You have a really big one that's sort of red with some hints of blue and green. So a really gorgeous image. So I'll go through a few more questions before we wrap things up. I can stop my sharing here. So again, if you're interested, it's hubblesite.org. Otherwise, you have the Cosmic Colors from NASA, and the Cosmic Reef is the name of the image that was released today for the anniversary. So a few more questions. Do things in space pick up dust? So that's super interesting. things that we launch up into space could potentially pick up Earth dust and put them up into space. And that's really bad. We don't want that. So when we build an instrument that we will launch up into space or even put in a telescope, we build them in what we call clean rooms. And so everyone has to wear like a full body suit and masks and helmets and goggles to make sure that they don't contaminate the object. Once it's launched up into space, it could theoretically pick up space dust. But even though space dust is all over the place, space is relatively empty. There's like not a lot of stuff up there. So even though you send something up, it would take a very, very long time if it was just floating through space for it to start picking up dust. If you go on someplace like the surface of the moon, however, it's a different story because there you can have a lot of dust. You might have seen like the footprint of astronauts that they left on the surface of the moon. That's because there's a pretty big layer of dust that's really easy to move around on the surface of the moon. So it's easy to put a footprint in there. How does a star burn if there is no oxygen on it? Super interesting question. So one of the conditions for something to be called a star is for a type of nuclear reaction to happen at its heart. And it's called nuclear fusion. So a star mostly is made up of a type of molecule. It's a type of atom. The simplest atom there is called hydrogen. And hydrogen, when it's all packed up in a big ball, if it's being sort of crushed under its own gravity, because there's just so much of it, and gravity likes to sort of keep things nice and tidy, at the center, where there's even more gravity and there's more pressure and more it's even more dense, sometimes you'll have hydrogen atoms that will be pushed up against each other, and they will eventually merge into a helium atom. That's the second simplest kind of atom. So that's called nuclear fusion, and nuclear fusion produces energy. That's something that we would eventually like to do here on Earth as like a sort of clean source of energy. If we could figure out how to do what stars do here, we would be able to create lots and lots of energies. So this happens at the heart of stars. You have this nuclear fusion, and this nuclear fusion sort of heats up the whole star. Eventually, the star will end up losing some of its gas. It will run out of hydrogen to power this nuclear fusion. And that's when you have the death of the star eventually. But so you don't actually need oxygen to burn, because it's not like a fire. It's not the same thing as if you're lighting up a fire in your fireplace with wood and you need some oxygen there. It's a totally different process, but we still say that a star burns just because it's a term that we're familiar with, but it's actually something called nuclear fusion. And maybe the last question that I'll tackle here, what is a neutron star? So neutron, spelled N-E-U-T-R-O-N. A neutron is, maybe you've heard of an electron or a proton. They're different components of what make up an atom. So everything in the universe around us, and also part of yourself, we're made up of atoms, and atoms can be broken down into smaller components. Electrons, which have a negative charge, protons, which have a positive charge, and neutrons, which have no charge. And essentially, at the end of the life of a star, when there's a big explosion called a supernova, different physical processes can happen such that what you're left over with at the end of the death of the star can be a neutron star, where the star is trying to collapse in on itself at the end of its life. But because there's a bunch of neutrons in there that don't want to be squeezed in together, they sort of push back on the star and stop it from becoming infinitely small and turning into a black hole. So if the star is really, really big, but not quite big enough to cause a sort of runaway collapse that causes a black hole, it sort of stays in the middle ground, and it turns into what we call a neutron star, which can still be very, very hot and emit very brightly in the X-ray. So that's what a neutron star is. It's one of the results that you can get at the end of a life of a very massive star.
There we go. I was having some trouble turning my camera on. Thank you so much, Nathalie, for your presentation today. We had a lot of excellent questions. There were a couple more that were coming in afterwards, but we don't have any more time to give. I think we have a link to maybe your Twitter. I don't remember for sure, but maybe we can send you some questions if some of the kids have
Sure. Yeah. Or you can also write questions on the Discover the Universe Facebook
True.
group, and then I can comment that. But if you want to tweet at me, my Twitter username is @AngryAstroPanda.
Perfect. So yeah, you guys can go to Facebook or Twitter to ask questions that you may not have got your answers to today, because there were lots that we couldn't get through. Again, thank you so much, Nathalie, for joining us today. And I've added the link to the website she was talking about in the description box below, as well as, just because so many of you guys were curious about what a kaleidoscope was, I added a video that is basically a kaleidoscope in the link in the description box below, so you can go check that out as well. There's also a bunch of other educational resources that are science-based in there if you wanted to try your hand at some other types of science that's going on. And if you liked Nathalie's presentation today, I invite you to put a rainbow emoji in the chat so we can show her how much you guys liked this discussion. And give the video a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel, and click the bell if you want to be notified when we're back on Monday. So thank you again, Nathalie. Thanks to everybody who came in live, and we'll see you on Monday.
Have a nice
Bye,
weekend,
guys.
everyone.